Hi, I'm Steve Moxon, an independent, cross-disciplinary science review researcher stroke writer, reader biological roots of human sociality and psychology with a focus on the sexes. This vid is to read my peer-reviewed science review paper, Misogyny Has No Scientific Basis of Any Kind. The evidence is of phylogeny and misandry. And I've left out of this vid the citations, bar a very few key ones, and sometimes just mentioning the researcher, so as to keep it uncluttered. They're all in the paper, of course. There is no such thing as misogyny. Not only does it not exist at all, but on the very contrary, all lines of scientific evidence reveal its very opposite, phylogeny and misandry. So the latter are real phenomena, whereas misogyny is a fiction. And to clarify terms, of course, there have always been individuals, women and men, who, through such as a series of failed romances, despise the other sex, and this remains a popular understanding of misogyny and its counterpart in the other direction, though the word to denote this, misandry, has never been in popular parlance, and that's for interesting reasons I'll come on to. The new non-popular, elite, academic, ideological notion of misogyny is something wholly different. The supposed universal male hatred of females. How this notion arose and developed is a matter of well-documented history, which reveals why it is bogus, as I'll also briefly outline later, but let me get straight into the scientific evidence. The key recent review and new investigation. There is not a single scientific study demonstrating the existence of misogyny as ideologically presumed. The relevant research field is termed gender attitudes. Recently, 2016, this has been reviewed and newly investigated by Dunham, Barron and Banerjee in a culmination of their own earlier work in various collaborations. Looking at not just explicit but more unusually also implicit measures, and, for the first time in the literature, across all age groups, they found boys/men expressed, quote, no negative association with female whatsoever. And just to clarify, implicit contrasts with explicit responses in being default, they automatic and are tapped into by taking only the immediate response, and to what is only indirectly evoked, avoiding prompting or providing for the cognitive process to modify or filter it. And the usual method is to measure the delay in responding to simultaneously presented stimuli. So a fast response indicates a close association in the subject's mind. Well, boys are only weakly positive to their own sex, and on implicit measures, with age this decreases so much that from adolescence onwards, males show by comparison a far stronger positive attitude towards females. A dramatic shift, as the authors themselves state. With explicit gender attitudes, there is also a shift, though here towards being neutral. The contrast with girls/women in all respects is striking. All age groups of females are, quote, robustly pro-female. That is, strongly positive towards females and strongly negative towards males, and all the more so with age. Furthermore, the authors' finding that there is no correlation between implicit and explicit measures reveals, as they themselves point out, that they tap into different independent psychology, which indicates a deep-seated basis. So, whether in respect of responses that are automatic, stroke default, or considered, the findings here indicate misogyny is a fiction, with misandry, on the other hand, real. Congruent earlier work. These findings build on much earlier research by Eagly et al., likewise showing that on explicit measures, by adulthood, males as well as females have more positive attitudes towards females than towards males. Eagly's work was to address the fatal flaws in all the studies hitherto, having used only false, indirect measures of gender attitudes, evoking what were merely assumed to be sex stereotypes, in turn merely assumed to entirely account for our impressions of others according to sex. The conclusion Both sexes are more positive towards women than towards men, both in attitude and emotional content, and, despite searching particularly for them, with no covert negative sentiments towards women, and no hidden ambivalence either. Further replication of findings. Subsequent to Eagle's team, their findings and conclusions have been replicated and confirmed by multiple others, who uncovered a strong automatic preference for females, yet no significant bias to their own sex in males, and using implicit as well as explicit measures. No pro-male attitude was uncovered other than by one team when they looked at errors in responses rather than latency, and anyway only a slightly pro-male attitude was found. Mixed results, that is pro-male as well as pro-female, were not obtained without making the male and female targets soldiers, which is an extreme condition introducing an obvious very strong demand characteristic confounding results. But even here there was no basis for interpreting in terms of any negative attitude to females. Female but no male homophily, that's homophily. Work squarely on what is conceived of as automatic in-group bias, homophily, which is the implicit preference for others of the same category to be considered fellow group members. This revealed that this was strong for women, whereas men had no preference at all for their own over the opposite sex. It's a 5-fold sex differential, according to Rudman and Goodwin, 2004, and this by a purer measure of implicit attitude, eliminating any confound with gender stereotypes, about more later. They further found a similar sex differential in respect of explicit measures. Women, quote, alone possess a cognitive mechanism that promotes own group preference. So, men have no cognitive mechanism either to preferentially consider other males as co-members of their group, or to exclude, or not to consider, women as fellow group members. On the contrary, a man, unlike a woman, sees everyone, men and women alike, as being fellow members of any symbolic grouping, which is a member, such as the whole workplace or company, university, year group, etc. By contrast, a woman has her own idiosyncratic individual grouping pattern cutting across symbolic organisational boundaries. The seminal paper here is by Maddox and Brewer in 2005, and several teams have published over the past decade showing the same phenomena, notably a 2015 paper titled Women Favour Dyadic Relationships but Men Prefer Clubs. Decades of studies of social structure show that females build personal networks on an exclusionary principle, as confirmed by Benenson in her 2013 paper, Social Exclusion, More Important to Human Females Than Males. Trying and failing to find misogyny in special conditions. Well, with the failure to demonstrate misogyny and the literature clearly indicating at worst neutral and usually very positive attitude of males towards females, attempts have ensued to find or manufacture special conditions evoking it. A Japanese team expected to find negativity towards women when gender was made salient in a situation where males might be thought to feel a threat to their sense of self-worth. But no evidence at all for this was found, only of an absence of positive association. And another team posited that women joining the workplace hierarchy would evoke negativity specifically in lower status men, but proper statistical analysis showed none even here. Sexism in its supposedly hostile form. With consistent failure to find evidence for hostility towards females or even of a pro-male attitude, research to try to establish the existence of misogyny has been distanced from gender attitude studies by employing a wider concept that can be conflated with and thereby misrepresented as misogyny. Putative misogyny would not be thus labelled if its appropriateness were to be directly considered rather than via this new wider concept. Discussion has come to be in terms of the more loosely, nay ill-defined notion of sexism. Now, the concept of sexism had begun as being defined simply as a negative attitude towards women, just as in gender attitudes research, but it was later diluted to any sort of prejudice or discrimination, and latterly to any attitude by virtue of the target's biological sex, rendering the notion meaningless. As sexism can be inadvertent, non-malicious, and even benign, then its conflation with misogyny allows an unacknowledged broadening of definition to misrepresent as misogyny a range of other phenomena. In turn, sexism can be qualified as negative, rather than neutral or positive, to assume the mantle of misogyny by the back door, sidestepping all the literature on gender attitudes. Gender attitudes have come to be seen as superficial to underlying sexism, yet this ignores that the research on implicit, as opposed to explicit, gender attitudes shows nothing covert. The major problem with the notion of negative, dubbed hostile sexism, is the deeply flawed operational definitions employed in studies. The most recent sexism inventory is criticised by Tostain in 2016, who cites 3 examples, the first 2 supposedly denoting the hostile form. These are: first, it is difficult for a woman to work as a boss. Second, men are incomplete without women. Third, women compared to men tend to display a greater moral sense. Now, agreement with one or more of those statements supposedly means you're sexist. Well, the first is most likely an expression of support for women against what they might face at work. The second asserts the importance of partnership between the sexes, which is an objective fact, and the gratitude towards or aggrandizement of women as partners. And the third praises women as being better than men, which is overtly pro-female and anti-male real sexism. The items have been included as supposedly sexist simply because they point to the reality of sex difference, which of course is anathema ideologically. Now, here are the items making up the standard measure of hostile sexism, and note that some are in the actual inventory are reverse worded and will be scored accordingly, and to avoid confusion I've here worded them correctly, as it were. So again, agreement with one or more of these statements supposedly means you're sexist. Here they are. Women exaggerate problems at work. Women are too easily offended. Most women interpret innocent remarks as sexist. When women lose fairly, they claim discrimination. Women seek special favours under the guise of equality. Feminists are making unreasonable demands. Feminists are seeking more power than men. Women seek power by gaining control over men. Many women tease men sexually. Once a man commits, she puts him on a tight leash. Women fail to appreciate all that men do for them. Now, this is self-evidently a list of anything but attitudes showing hostility, even inadvertently. All of the items are open to various interpretation. Given the current hegemonic identity politics incorporating extreme feminism, then most, if not all, are not inaccurate generalizations. Common personal experience routinely shared with others. The majority view shared across the sexes. Not only not unreasonable opinion, but as near objective as opinion gets, if not plain fact. Some of the statements are simple, legitimate and deserved criticism of ideological feminism, with which many or most would agree for reasons of being supportive of women rather than through expressing any antipathy. Not endorsing extreme feminism, or those articulating the ideology, is in no way negativity towards women. Sexism dubbed benevolent, but not thus considered. There is also a benevolent sexism scale, and the items face the same criticism, but magnified and self-evident. Here are the scale items. A good woman should be set on a pedestal. Women should be cherished and protected by men. Men should sacrifice to provide for women. In a disaster, women should be rescued first. Women have a superior moral sensibility. Women have a quality of purity few men possess. Women have a more refined sense of culture, taste. Every man ought to have a woman he adores. Men are incomplete without women. Despite accomplishment, men are incomplete without women. People usually are not happy without heterosexual romance. Benevolent sexism is envisaged as being, alongside hostile sexism, within a general category, ambivalent sexism. The empty concept of stereotype threat. How putative ambivalent sexism is presumed to harm women is by supposedly evoking a sex stereotype that is in turn assumed to be interpreted by women as being what is or what is not expected of them. It is held that self-inhibition then ensues to avoid anticipated punishment of some kind for carrying out what otherwise would be a chosen role beyond a traditional one. Akin to the concept of internalized misogyny, which itself is a non-parsimonious, implausible, non-evidence construct based in turn on another contra-evidence construct, this supposed mechanism of harm is dubbed stereotype threat. Coined over 20 years ago, initially regarding African American race issues, in respect of sex, very serious problems with this construct are apparent, not least when explicit measures are used. Not merely is there no negative impact of presenting a stereotype, but several investigations by separate teams have all shown that a positive outcome is produced, entirely contrary to prediction. Well, all of the literature on this topic was reviewed in 2012 by Sturt and Geary, who find that there is no evidence at all for the phenomenon, not least through the multiple major methodological flaws in common to experimentation across the entire field. Most importantly, this is in the absence of a control group and inappropriate data adjustments, as is the case in almost all of the anyway minority replication attempts that supposedly showed an effect regarding maths. Others have taken further issue with data adjustment and concluded that even if stereotype threat were a factor, it's so tiny as to be an irrelevant one. The suspicion must be that this failure to adhere to basic scientific procedure was necessary to be able to build any literature on stereotype threat in the first place. So in the wake of Sturt and Geary's review, several further attempts at replication using large samples have all failed. Many more failed attempts over the past 20 years have gone unpublished because, as a review has established, non-replication is shunned by journals as not interesting. A more recent 2016 review by Tostain is comprehensively damning. His conclusion is that contrary to interpretation proffered in social psychology studies, the impact of presenting stereotypes is one among multiple factors, and anyway in itself very small. Quote, stereotypes do not necessarily have the power that is often attributed to them. Firstly, the perception and the judgments of individuals are not necessarily altered by gender stereotypes, and in addition, measures of gender stereotyping are not necessarily neutral and can direct one towards a vision that artificially accentuates the presence and weight of stereotypes. Finally, the predictive value, in terms of links with discriminatory behaviours, of tests for the evaluation of stereotypes, particularly gender stereotypes, remains subject to debate. Tostain outlines what he sees as the fundamental problem of, quote, misunderstanding the fact that individuals can make reference to stereotypes according to different levels of judgment and different perspectives, unquote, when everything is geared, quote, implicitly to adopt a univocal causal schema born of a vision of masculine domination. The upshot is that, quote, individuals are constantly faced with heterogeneous dynamics, some of which can be opposed to these stereotypes. So the notion of stereotype threat is an imaginary phenomenon, not a real one. As with misogyny, this is not a case of the phenomenon requiring an explanation, but of a belief requiring the invention of a phenomenon through a tendentious interpretation of what is observed in stage scenarios far from real life, so as to retrospectively justify the belief. Circular reasoning. An even more fundamental problem is in definitions. Whereas the hostile form is defined as dominative paternalism, derogatory beliefs and heterosexual hostility, the benevolent variant is seen as protective paternalism, idealisation of women and desire for intimate relations. So all intersexual interaction is now deemed sexist, an entirely circular reasoning. Sexism in this new ambivalent wider conceptualisation is deemed the cause of patriarchy and traditional gender roles, but anything and everything about those roles and patriarchy is deemed to constitute sexism. The claim is that they are one and the same, with sexism its own etiology. A perfect circularity of argument, leaving no hypothesis to test, a non-explanation that cannot be a scientific hypothesis. The whole sexism project has become an exercise in unfalsifiability, the cardinal sin in science. As it can't be disproven, even in principle, it is by definition not scientific. The notion of sexism has been elided with that of misogyny to mean the same thing, ubiquitous male hostility to females, with the supposed phenomenon of misogyny entirely lacking in evidence and therefore clearly false. Sexism has been developed as a construct always to escape this eventuality through becoming stretched to encompass any and every data, instead of data being used to test an hypothesis. It's nothing more than a quasi-religious belief. Misogyny is not through control. The male is not the controlling partner. Right, moving beyond notions of sexism, controlling behaviour within couples is a potential harm to women that conceivably might be an expression of misogyny, but again research reveals the inverse of expectation. It is not men who typically try to prevent their partner from straying, it is women. Vogel et al. 2007 find overall that the woman partner has complete charge of the relationship, both taking responsibility in representing it to the outside world and acting within it. Quote, wives behaviourally exhibited more domineering attempts and were more dominant, i.e. more likely to have their partner give in, than husbands during discussions of either spouse's topic, unquote. It was found in earlier research, back in 1986, that a woman is a controlling partner in 90% of couples. And more recently, within the past decade, that women were more likely than men to be categorised as showing high control. Another team found that women even utilise male modes of control, at least as much as do men. This will be expected to produce a very large asymmetry in favour of female perpetration, in that women will hugely, if not exclusively, predominate in female modes, because males adopting such modes would lose status, something which males always strive to avoid. This picture, entirely contrary to the contemporary portrayal in media and by academia, is no surprise. It's the form of popular understanding. The one theme rivalling sex in those comic English seaside postcards of old, and in line with the basis of the evolution of human pair bonding being in the female rather than in the male interest. And for that, see my 2013 paper on this and my brand new paper on this topic. Misandry, the real sexism is unseen. With misogyny a figment of ideological imagination, it is a charge of misogyny that becomes itself the very concept for or hatred very contempt for or hatred towards the other sex it purports to call out. In other words, accusation of misogyny actually is itself a manifestation of hostile sexism in the form of misandry, making this the real phenomenon now in need of study. This ideological misandry is merely a further expression of something with much deeper roots, as suggested by the data generated in all the failed quests to establish the existence of misogyny. Notably, what has been revealed about the stark sex dichotomy in in-grouping, whereby women, but not men, group according to an exclusionary principle, and that this is far more towards the opposite sex. That this actual sexism is not seen for what it is shows up in research into bias. Evidently, sexism of any form by females is unseen, not just women's anti-male sexism, but also their anti-female sexism, this being the perception of both males and other females. Hence the great surprise that greeted the Demos findings in 2016 that the bulk of misogynistic so-called abuse on Twitter was by not men, but by women. Women are biased to misperceive hostile sexism from men when it isn't there, conversely not seeing men's benevolent sexism when it is. By contrast, men actually underestimate women's hostile sexism towards them, as well as overestimating women's benevolent sexism. Notwithstanding these biases, as well as hegemonic anti-male ideology, research reveals not only female hostile sexism, but that this is at the same level as that attributed to men, the only sex difference being in respect of benevolent sexism, which is more evident in men. In other words, women, unlike men, tend to exhibit their sexism in a hostile rather than a benevolent manner. Misandry is acknowledged in a large multinational study by a team led by the principal contemporary researcher of sexism, Peter Glick, responsible for the sexism inventories, who concedes that they are, quote, hostile as well as benevolent attitudes toward men. The misconceived notion of male intersexual dominance. This is a notion, or is predicated on the notion, that sexism is male intersexual dominance. But it is now clear that dominance in all species, ourselves included, is always a male not intersexual phenomenon. And for reviews, see my 2016 book, Sexism Explained, and my first 2009 paper. Not only do males not incorporate females into their dominance hierarchy, but females across species do not have the neural circuitry to process the winner and or loser effects necessary to form actual dominance hierarchy, even among themselves. See Vandenberg, Lamberlace and Kushner, 2015, a groundbreaking paper. Females no more have the facility to be subdominant, that is subordinate, to males than males would attempt to be dominant over them. This means that in the workplace or other civic spaces that in a traditional society will be the arena of male intersexual competition, a hierarchy will not be psychologically salient to girls/women. Instead, they will attempt to fit in other ways, aided by the complete absence of same-sex preference in male in-grouping. Women are bound to experience difficulty in mapping female sociality onto the social structure of the workplace, which has to be hierarchical through business competition and efficiency imperatives. It's mistaken to attribute their difficulties to obstacles placed by males through some putative male-to-female hostility. Harassment is not a residual category of misogyny. Female misperception heavily undermines studies of sexual harassment, another category of behaviour that might be thought to embody misogyny. With women liable to both invent male hostility and to be blind to male benevolence, then studies of harassment would have to control for these confounds, which can't be done. All these are likely to pertain to all female-male interaction. This compounds what anyway are multiple problems with eye of the beholder effects, the perception of who is and who isn't an harasser, and what is and what is not harassment. For reasons of basic evolutionary biological logic, both sexes are highly likely to overperceive each other's sexual interests. Males, so as not to miss a reproductive opportunity; females, so as to avoid less than perfect reproductive opportunities. Men display their mate value in terms of their intersexual dominance in a call and response dialogue with the female, so that the female can better examine the male's potential as a suitable mate. Female proceptive behaviour actively invites this, even though rejecting the male is the likeliest outcome in the end. The male display here is an advertisement of dominance vis-a-vis his fellow males, not, of course, with respect to the female being courted. Overdone, non-reciprocated wooing naturally is likely to be viewed as harassment from the female's perspective, but it is sexual interest in the female, a positive, hardly a negative attitude. To suggest otherwise is unwarranted denigration of male sexuality. The notion that a high-status male is expressing power in making sexual overtures also ignores that such males can realistically anticipate a favourable response to sexual entreaty, for the obvious reason that they are likely to be particularly attracted to women. That a male may use his workplace position as a basis of making sexual advances is often misrepresented as the use of sexuality to impose power, when it is the other way around. The mistake here is imputing to the male a motivation based on the female target feeling that her ability to make a mate choice is being constrained, as likely would be the case if the male was such as a lowly line manager. If instead the male is high status, such as a company executive, then the female target's attitude is liable to completely change, as shown in experiments. A comprehensive rebuttal to the notion that sexual harassment is about power rather than sex is provided in 2002 by Brown, who includes a good outline of the misperception as harassment of women being hazed in formerly all-male workplaces. As an informal means of establishing membership of the work group, hazing, initiation rites or ragging, is male intersexual behaviour poorly understood by women, who may feel threatened by it even when males are extending hazing to encompass women for the very reason of trying to be especially inclusive. For a variety of interrelated reasons, then, it is only to be expected that the literature on harassment is very confused. Brown's is the most wide-ranging, comprehensive, non-ideological overview available. Mostly, though, there persists an overwhelmingly feminist, social constructivist and advocacy stance inimical to science, failing to tease out or identify confounds, if not adding to them. The problems, even from a sympathetic sociological perspective, are laid bare in two overviews in 2009, bemoaning the complexity of and poor evidence for theories. The coup de grace against the concept of harassment is that what constitutes harassment has become whatever it may be deemed to be by anyone claiming to be in receipt of it, or indeed even by any third-party observer, in which category would be an experimenter in an harassment study. Harassment, thereby, is now every bit as perfectly circular in definition as is sexism. In any case, the notion of sexual/gender harassment as instead somehow embodying or being underpinned by hatred, contempt, or any negativity towards females is so lacking in a scientific theoretical basis that it will require very substantial evidence indeed, with strong external validity, for it to be taken as less pejorative and ideological than substantive. Inasmuch then as harassment could be considered a residual category of behaviour that in the male to female direction might be the last refuge of some basis of misogyny, well, any attempt along these lines to try to establish misogyny as a real phenomenon surely will be no more successful than the others. Denial of the existence of the sexes. The current academic line is simply that men and women seeing each other in biological terms causes gender inequality. This notion is reflected in the definitions of sexism. At root, this is just an assertion that a new cultural view will supersede biology. as if it were some mere historical aberration, in ignorance of the fact that culture is part of biology, having evolved to function to feedback, to fine-tune and reinforce the very biology that gave rise to it. Insistence that culture is socially constructed serves the ideological need for it to be malleable and not essential, inherent, leaving it replaceable, supposedly, by a new human reality in line with Marxist dogma, which, as the philosopher John Gray outlines, actually is a residue of Christian promised land ideation. With sexism circularly defined, inequality is considered inherent and irredeemable. The only solution in this view is the elimination of the sexes. The idea appears to be nothing more sophisticated than a self-fulfilling prophecy, that by persistently asserting the need for an end to their being sexes, eventually it will be brought about. But it's not the sexes both, but the male sex, of course, that is for elimination. With no male sex, there would remain no sexes to distinguish it as female, so in place of men and women, there would be considered simply people. This absurd, astonishing flight of fancy is in the service of solving a cognitive dissonance within the Marxist mindset. Marxist theory had proved completely false, with no revolution anywhere in advanced capitalist societies, even after one occurred in feudal Russia, entirely contrary to the theory. So Marxists turned on Western workers, dismissing them, with males being those who would have taken up arms, obviously, and for whom work is their raison d'etre, and by how they are judged, then naturally Western workers were envisaged as all male. From then on regarded as turncoats, blacklegs indeed, they were deemed in need of replacement as the supposed vanguards of social change, to be replaced by women. See my paper, The Origin of Identity Politics. This is a taproot of the insistence on maintaining the contemporary notion of misogyny, notwithstanding that it's a non-existent phenomenon. Conclusion. There is zero evidence for misogyny anywhere, even when the concept is watered down and obfuscated in a retreat behind the notion of sexism by absurdly widening, then complicating and rendering it entirely circular. Efforts to save the concept instead actually confirm there is no actual phenomenon to investigate. Furthermore, the supposed mode of harm of diluted notions of misogyny in stereotype threat proves to be a complete chimera. This is no surprise, as there is no theoretical basis of misogyny other than in extreme ideology, which itself is indeed anti-scientific. There is, on the contrary, fairly obvious theoretical basis for phylogeny and misandry, which easily can be formalised in cogent evolutionary biological terms. Political history explains the need to conceive misogyny irrespective of whether it has any reality or indeed even in full knowledge that it is a chimera. It is inescapable that the construct of misogyny is naked anti-male ideology, solving the left's mindsets cognitive dissonance by blaming the workers, supported by natural anti-male prejudice, misandry. The issue then is to explain a deeper misandry, but this is no mystery, that females foundationally in effect are celebrities, in collectively being the limiting factor in reproduction, as they are in all species, is bound to elicit not only very special consideration towards females generically, prompting the protection of females, especially from sexual access by males, but in any and every respect, but correspondingly deep suspicion towards males generically, prompting the policing of males, especially in regard to sex, but also in any and every respect. This is just as is found in the failed attempts to find misogyny, only phylogeny being evident. Phylogeny drives anticipation of potential harm that may befall women and girls, even when it's unlikely or simply not present, even indeed when unlikely or absent in principle. And just as this harm to women is a figment, so too is a putative agent capable of causing the requisite harm. Given the protection towards females and suspicion towards males, women themselves hardly are likely to be considered agentic here. Males are. In identifying males as the supposed agents capable of causing harm to females, it is by natural extension that intent to cause harm is mistakenly imputed to men. Consequently, sex, typically male activity, that may in any way be conceived of as potentially causing harm to females is presumed indeed to do so. Hence, misandry can be misrepresented as its obverse, misogyny. The notion of misogyny surely is the deepest, most tenacious false myth in all human imagination. The older background. There is another take on all this. The notion of female inferiority, which appears to be a long-developed misinterpretation through failing to appreciate that whereas men in the most important respects cannot be compared to women, women can be compared to men. Key female functions, conception, gestation, giving birth, lactating and maternal complete bonding with offspring, are all impossible for a male to perform. By contrast, male roles, barring insemination obviously, at least in principle and to some if not full extent, can be performed by both sexes. Consequently, men are seen as completely different from women, whereas women vis-a-vis men can be found wanting, differing in performance by degree, not absolutely. Hence the notion of female inferiority, notwithstanding that in female terms women are supreme beyond any comparison to men, and always are thus regarded because the female, to repeat, is the limiting factor in reproduction in humans as in all species. Women can never be considered inferior per se, quite the contrary. So it is that despite women invariably having been held in higher regard than men, at the very same time they could be regarded as inferior. Males in comparison to females are intrinsically competitive. See my paper on this, 2015 I think. Men fiercely vie with each other when they feel they can play to their strengths whilst dropping out of arenas where they realise they may be weak. Hence a large proportion of men who are either very high or very low performers. Lots of both geniuses and dunces, as it were. Women instead bunch around the median, and you can see this in the very different normal distribution curves according to sex, regardless of what you're talking about. Distorted comparison between only male high flyers and females in general stems from the social invisibility of poorly performing and consequently low status and low mate value males. By contrast, females correspondingly low in fertility are not invisible. Any female has a significant mate value, whereas many or even most males do not. Hence females are seen as more valuable than males. The historical supposition that men are inferior surely was a highly qualified one, not pejorative, but over time nuance will be lost in simplification to women being inferior per se, even as women overall are seen as incomparably superior to men. Driving the oversimplification is the understanding that we are not motivated to behave non-sex typically. In the case of women, by reason of competitiveness, compromising display of their femininity, their female mate value. So it is that competitiveness per se, in all but a restricted context, is almost inimical to females. That men are physically incapable of performing key female roles precludes motivation being an issue for them, but mostly it's not lack of ability behind female relatively depressed performance that leads to a view of women as, in a sense, psychologically inferior. Not inaccurately describing to females lack of drive to carry out easily performable, albeit alien-seeming roles, is not expressing disdain for women. It's only in the minds of extreme ideologues whose hatred for men means that when they think they have a window on men, actually they are staring into a mirror. The end. Thank you. Thank you for watching and listening. Cheers. you.